For my project on the red drum, I've decided to write a children's short story called Robbie the Redfish Visits His Grandpa. One day, Robbie the Redfish was sitting in the grass flats of Mosquito Lagoon on the east coast of Florida. He had just finished a successful morning of hunting with a school of about 6 of his friends who were about 3 years old and 17 inches long, about the same as he was. They had hunted around the seagrass that surrounded some nearby sandbars, holes, and flats in their area of the estuary. As young subadults, this is where they spent most of their time. They had spent most of their earlier years far up in the tidal marshes and creeks. They filled up on small shrimp, minnows, and marine worms, and were quite satisfied with their breakfast. He couldn't wait until he was bigger and older so that he could hunt larger prey, like crabs and larger fish. He didn't want to stay visible in the shallow water too long. It was a clear day, so even in the dense grass, he didn't want to risk being seen by an osprey as the sun continued to rise. He decided to go visit his grandfather, Richard the Redfish, who lived in deeper water, a bit closer to the ocean. "Robbie, it's great to see you," said Richard, who was about 50 inches long and 35 years old, which is nearly as large and old as redfish can get. "What brings you by?" "Some of my school friends and I had a good breakfast earlier this morning, and I wanted to get off the flats before all the predators like ospreys and dolphins would have an easier time seeing me in the sunlight," Robbie replied. "Great work, Robbie. With instincts like those, you should have no trouble growing as big and as old as I am. And you know that if you're chased by something, that's what your eye spot is for, right?" "Yep," said Robbie. "The predators think my eye is on my tail, so when they aim there, I just slip out of the way and escape." "That's right, Robbie," said a proud Richard. "And even if you do get nipped on the tail, you'll probably be all right. While you're here, why don't I tell you about our family's history? I don't think you've heard it before." "Thanks, Grandpa. I haven't heard it before. I'm really curious." So Richard began to tell his grandson about the history of redfish. "Well, back before my time, in the 50s and 60s, we were doing great. All along our territory from the Texas-Mexico border up to about New Jersey, we could pretty much do as we pleased and weren't bothered much at all. Then, in the 70s and 80s, the humans began to fish for us quite heavily. It all started when a few chefs over in Louisiana started making delicious Cajun dishes out of redfish, and that sparked an increase in demand nationwide. Because we often moved around in big schools in relatively shallow water, we were pretty easy for the fishermen to catch, especially in gill nets. By the time I had hatched, there weren't many redfish around at all." "That sounds terrible, Grandpa," Robbie exclaimed. "But today, it seems like we're doing really well. What happened?" Richard continued, "Well, once there weren't very many of us left, it wasn't worthwhile for the fishermen to try to catch us anymore. They had lost interest for a few years, and that let us recover a bit. Then they instituted some conservation policies." "What's that?" Robbie asked. "Conservation means keeping natural resources like plants and animals, including redfish, around and healthy so that they can last for a very long time. At the rate they were going, we would have been almost wiped out within a few more years." Most of the states changed their ways sometime in the late 80s or early 90s. Here in Florida, one of the changes that helped us the most was the ban on gill nets in 1995. Also, it's against the law to fish commercially for redfish in Florida. We're strictly a game fish now. "So I never have to worry about getting caught?" Robbie asked eagerly. "Not exactly," said Richard. "There's still a recreational fishery where anglers can keep 1 or 2 redfish per person per day here in Florida, depending on the region. For us here in Mosquito Lagoon, it's just 1, and we have to be let go unless we're between 18 and 27 inches. Even then, many sportsmen choose to release us anyway. But if you leave Florida, the rules change, and there are still some limited commercial fisheries in a few places like Mississippi and North Carolina. So once I grow another inch, I'll have to start being pretty careful not to eat anything with a hook," exclaimed Robbie. "That's right," Richard replied with a chuckle. But with the conservation efforts and increasing catch and release ethic among fishermen, your odds are looking pretty good. How's everything else going? Do you have a girlfriend yet? Grandpa, groaned an exasperated Robbie. Richard continued, well, when you do meet a girl that you think you might like, that's when you need to drum to get her attention. In fact, that's how we got our name. Do you know how to drum? I sure do, exclaimed Robbie, as he used his specialized muscles to rub against his swim bladder. Well, when you get a little bigger and the time comes, you'll gather around major inlets and passes, usually in the fall. That's when spawning will happen, and then you could even be a father yourself, explained Richard. Well, thanks for spending some time with me today, Grandpa, said Robbie. I think I should head back and meet up with my school friends. As Robbie swam back to his area of the estuary, he thought about everything Richard had told him, and was happy that he got to live after all the gillnets and commercial fishermen had gone elsewhere. On his way, he even said hello to his cousins, Sally the sea trout, who was really a drum also, and Billy the black drum. Robbie found his friends, and they settled down for the night, dreaming about all the shrimp and minnows that they would catch in the morning. And that's the end. And my sources came from a variety of places, mostly state agencies and a few academic organizations. I've got the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, Texas Wildlife Department, a report by the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, a report by the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center, and then blueocean.org, which is a conservation organization. Thank you for watching.